For more than a decade, a young Canadian man would struggle with health issues and insomnia. The man was lost and couldn't quite seem to get his life together. Something was off, yet the man couldn't quite put his finger on it. Then one day the man picked up a copy of Bud Hopkins' book named Missing Time, and suddenly the man knew why he had been having problems. In this episode, we will explore this incredibly strange alien abduction from Canada, a case that has come to be known as the 1973 Wagon Alien Abduction. Sometime in 1973, in Jordan, Ontario, 4 members of a Canadian band wrapped up a show at Alice's restaurant and began moving their instruments outside to their van. As they were packing it up, a strange man would approach the group and inquire whether he could grab a ride with them. The band didn't recognize the man, nor did they see him while they were playing their gig. Regardless, the band agreed to take the man, a decision that would haunt band member Thomas Campbell for years. While it's not certain that this person was not human, as we will see, all signs point to some sort of connection to the events that would happen to the band members. As the van pulled out of Alice's restaurant, the group began driving down a service road, with band member Guillaume driving and the drummer in shotgun. The other 2 band members, including Tom, were in the back with the strange man. It's not known specifically why they took this route, and we will discuss later perhaps they were subconsciously influenced. As they were driving down the road though, the driver would suddenly spot strange lights up ahead. He didn't think too much of it at first, a common first impression when individuals first spot bright UFOs in desolate areas. However, as they drove closer, Guillaume would suddenly slam on the brakes. Thomas, who was in the back, would yell, "What's going on up there?" Guillaume responded, "I think you better come up here and take a look at this." The band members would all climb up, all except the strange man. There, the group were stunned to see a silver metallic craft blocking the road, and after some debate, decided to drive back to Alice's restaurant for the time. However, when Guillaume tried to turn the car around, he lost control of it. The car froze, and then began hovering toward the craft a bit closer until it was around 30 feet away. While the frightened group watched in silence, the strange man sat in the back, as if he knew this was going to happen, and perhaps even more frightening, he had led them there. As they looked upon the craft, a hatch opened up. The drummer would spot the beings, and they would exit the craft. As the men sat in the van, the beings walked to the side of the van, and the band members watched as the beings tried to open the side door, but with no luck. Tom would see one of the creatures head right by the window. At some point during this commotion, the strange man would open the back door, and the band would be stunned to see 4 beings. They had white grayish skin with large black eyes. The beings had only 3 fingers, all of which were quite long. The beings were short, being around 4 feet tall, and also, interestingly, were reported by Thomas to smell like aftershave. This is a detail which we will discuss later in the video. One of the beings, who appeared to be the leader, climbed in the van. It was dark and tough to make out details, but telepathically the alien communicated to the men it came in peace and not to be afraid. The being asked the crew if 3 of them would come with them so they could run some tests. The group communicated telepathically they would. As the being first climbed out of the van, it would knock off some musical equipment onto the ground. The frightened drummer assured the being, who Thomas called the captain, that the drummer was okay. When Thomas grabbed some recorders to bring on board, the other band members were terrified and couldn't understand why he was bringing it. The captain read their thoughts and assured them it was okay to bring. Thomas, along with the bassist and drummer, would exit the craft and follow the beings. They walked through an egg-shaped door of which the drummer would bang his head hard upon entering. The captain checked to see if the drummer was okay, letting him know they could heal him. Once inside, the trio walked down a hallway, and this led to a room with 3 silver-colored cots. They were instructed to take off their clothes. Thomas asked if they could keep their underwear on, and the captain obliged. At this point, the bass player took off his pants, but had on long johns. The trio would then laugh at the situation, and according to Thomas, the beings even seemed to understand the humor of the situation. The situation seemed to indicate that the band members felt quite comfortable at this point, yet whether they should have is debatable. At this point, the aliens brought in a cart with metal instruments and other devices on it. One of the beings would first grab some sort of light device and shine it on Thomas's skin. Thomas didn't see the light, but as he looked at his skin, he could see everything: veins, arteries, bones. Thomas then laid back on a table, and the beings would do the same scan of his whole body. Next, Thomas was asked to look at a light. It seemed to hypnotize him and wipe his memories. Once Thomas and the other band members woke up the next day, they would forget the events. However, this story is far from complete. For the next 10 years, memories of this event were blocked for Thomas, and presumably also for the other band members. Then sometime in the early 1980s, Thomas would read Bud Hopkins' book, Missing Time, and memories of these events would come back. It's not evident what triggered it specifically, or if the events all came back at once, like what happens sometimes from people suffering from amnesia. That said, he couldn't recall everything. He still had missing time in events that he couldn't recall, and for that, he would reach out to Bud Hopkins, who would arrange a hypnotherapy session with therapist Dr. Aphrodite Clammer. Working with Dr. Clammer, Thomas would recall that night, after he was hypnotized by the strange object, he was taken to another room. Thomas was laying down, and around 5 aliens would wheel over a large machine with several different types of arms, with hoses and instruments. The beings would check over his whole body, taking hair and skin samples and putting them in tubes. After this, Thomas was told to dress, and the other 2 men joined him. Altogether, the beings would ask the men if they had any questions for them. One of the band members asked, "Are you from outer space?" To which the beings responded yes. One other question was, "Do you have bases on Earth?" The captain would respond, "Yes, we have many bases on Earth, some underwater, some in desolate areas where few people go. We have one here," pointing out to one of the portholes towards Lake Ontario. The next question Thomas would ask seemed to surprise the beings. What is the true religion on Earth? The beings were perplexed and answered, "Why would you ask a question like that?" Thomas responded by stating they were intellectually superior. The beings would state, "There's no correct religion on Earth," which seemed to surprise Thomas. 2 of the band members were then escorted out, with Thomas staying behind. The experience appeared to be a positive one, with the drummer smiling and waving back at the beings as he walked toward the van. Inside the ship, Thomas recalled he was going into a trance-like state and was overwhelmed with feelings of joy. Thomas was told that he had a special mission in helping their work and would be a beacon of light to people around him, helping people appreciate that aliens are real and that it was important work to do. He was then brought out of the trance-like state. Thomas then remembered the recorders in the bag, and he showed them to the beings. The being said, "What are these?" "Musical instruments. We play them for our entertainment." The being responded, "How do you play them?" Thomas said, "You blow air into them." Oddly, the alien didn't understand what it was being told. Thomas then put on a demonstration playing the recorder. The alien seemed to like it, and Thomas gave him one of the recorders as a souvenir. The being didn't understand what a souvenir was, though. As Thomas explained and gave it to him, he would notice the being had 3 fingers and nails that were long and curved down. The captain would then offer to walk Thomas back to the car, but Thomas declined. As he began walking back, he noticed his face was itchy, and soon he realized he had been crying. As Thomas came around the back of the van, he noticed that everyone was in a trance, sitting like zombies. The craft then suddenly shot off and the group slowly began to come out of their hypnotized state. The strange man was now gone, and soon the group began to discuss what exactly they should do next. The drummer would say, "No, we can't report this. Everyone will think we are crazy. No one will believe us, and I don't want to be ridiculed over something like this." The guitarist, who didn't enter the craft, agreed on keeping it a secret too. It is thought the hybrid being stayed in the band and hypnotized the guitarist. Tom disagreed with the two and wanted to report the incident, but the group stated that if he did, they would deny the event. Still, perhaps what happened next was the most shocking aspect of this entire bizarre case. As the group was driving home, Thomas kept hearing a voice in his head saying, "You will forget this, you will forget this, you will forget this." Thomas fought it, and he fought it, and then finally, after some time, asked, once again to the drummer and guitarist, "Should we report this?" The two men were completely baffled and said, "Report what?" The two men had already forgotten the incident. Thomas would return home, and that night, still fighting the command, attempted to write down the details of the night, but at some point he forgot and wound up going to bed. As stated, Thomas would recall many of the conscious memories after reading Lost Time, and the hidden ones through hypnosis. It's not known 100% how or what exactly triggered the memory recollection, but something in that book did. That said, what can we make of this fascinating close encounter of the fourth kind? The case has many interesting characteristics and elements that we see often in other cases. Perhaps the most interesting is the aspect of mind control. The beings seem to be able to clearly control the emotions and perceived experiences of the band members. In addition, they were able to block certain memories, while they seemed not too concerned with others. It's important to point out too that mind control and blocking memories is not really advanced. Even many humans are capable of hypnotizing others and getting them to behave in certain ways. Still, the interesting thing is that some people appear to be very easy to hypnotize, while others not so much. This is certainly relevant in this case, one in which the memories went away quicker for the band members than for Thomas. In addition to mind control and repressing memories, it is thought too the beings are capable of distorting perceptions, leaving many to believe their alien abduction experience was positive. This appeared to happen in this case, but looking at the facts, these men appear to have had their emotions manipulated. It's tough to imagine these band members would agree to be tested like they were. Many of the elements of the case are classic and things we see time and time again. The beings appeared to be grays, and the craft was silver-shaped and oval. The craft grabbed them on a desolate road. Perhaps the only strange detail that didn't add up in this case is that the beings were said to smell like aftershave. In many cases, grays are said to stink and smell quite horrible. It's been reported in a number of cases, and often their smell is the one thing most people remember. There are various theories on why they smell so bad. One of them states that these beings are biological, yet have no organs to dispose of waste. Many theorize they excrete their waste through their skin. That said, some believe greys are not biological and are actually robots, and it's something in their technology. Coming back to the case, it's widely believed the hitchhiker was connected to the beings. He was said to look human and didn't act surprised when the craft appeared. He also opened the door, although it seems that the Greys could have probably done this themselves. One of the key questions is around the other band members too. They stated they would not admit the story, but did Bud Hopkins and Thomas try to track them down? Having even a second witness would have really added incredible validity to the case. Coming back to the questions to the beings, of the questions, it's tough to really conclude much. The beings said they were from outer space, but it's possible they live hidden on Earth or in a different dimension. Probably the most interesting question has to do with the bases on planet Earth. It's long been thought ETs have bases on Earth, and we've seen this on prior episodes. The religion question seems open to interpretation as well, although some might see it as evidence we were seeded by something else. Still, perhaps the most frustrating thing about this case is the beings told Thomas he had a special purpose and that he would be instrumental in letting the world know about the beings. We see this in quite a number of cases, and it also draws a lot of criticism for several reasons. The first one being, why don't ETs ever take world leaders or people who have the ability to really change things? Another reason is, why take someone, tell him what they told Thomas, and then wipe his memory? That said, Thomas, after his sessions with the hypnotherapist, was able to uncover many more alien abductions that happened to him. Some of them are quite incredible, and one even involved his father, which isn't that surprising, as there are many cases where multiple family members are taken. On February 6, 1970, Canadian police officer Bob Crawford was dispatched to settle a domestic dispute in St. Catharines, Ontario. Officer Crawford arrived at 237 Church Street, apartment 1, and quickly settled the dispute. As he was leaving the apartment, another resident in the building frantically approached him. The woman pleaded for Crawford's help in her apartment, and he obliged. He didn't know it at the time, but Crawford was about to experience the strangest case of his career. In this episode, we will examine the frightening poltergeist of St. Catharines, Ontario. As Officer Crawford walked in the woman's apartment, he was astonished to see it was a complete disaster. Furniture was overturned, picture frames were broken, and there was a complete mess all over the floor. What he was told next would truly shock him, though. The woman who stopped him, named Barbara Page, informed him that the disarray was caused by some unknown force or ghost. Crawford decided to get more details, and he spoke not only with Barbara, but her entire family. Barbara had 2 sons, 11-year-old Peter and 8-year-old Mark. Her husband, John, was there as well. The family would tell him that the furniture had been moving by itself with no known cause. Perhaps even more bizarre, this had been happening the last 10 days. While Crawford was initially skeptical, he soon witnessed the paranormal activity himself. He saw a heavy dresser get knocked down by something. Crawford, convinced at this point, was unsure of what to do, so he called the Roman Catholic Church. He would speak with Father Stevens, and a short time later, Father Stevens would arrive at the Page household. Officer Crawford would be surprised to learn Father Stevens had been to the house just a few days earlier. Then, he experienced paranormal activity in the apartment. In particular, he saw a bed move away from the wall all by itself. Father Stevens pushed it back into place, and as he walked away, the bed moved back out again. The Page family was frightened at this point and was unsure what to do. Officer Crawford suggested everyone move into the living room to discuss options. As Crawford was walking out of the kitchen, he moved a chair under the table. While discussing what to do, the group would hear the eerie sounds of footsteps going across the living room. Everyone froze, and they listened as the footsteps went into the kitchen. Officer Crawford and Father Stevens then cautiously walked back into the kitchen. There, they would be shocked to see the chair had moved back out to the center of the room. A few moments later, police officer Bill Wire arrived. Wire was there to back up Crawford at the domestic disturbance call. When Wire heard about the events, he wasn't surprised though. Wire said just 1 month earlier, he had responded to a call from residents in the building. They complained of hearing odd noises all day and all night. Wire had the utility companies come out and investigate. However, nothing abnormal was found with their systems. Soon that night, Wire would eyewitness the paranormal activity himself. On a shelf sat a row of bowling trophies. Wire watched as they fell one by one off the shelf. He also noticed the hands on the kitchen clock being pushed around, seemingly by themselves. More supernatural activity occurred, and the officers speculated that it was tied to 11-year-old Peter Page. For instance, as Peter walked by, the officers noted how pictures would sway on the walls. After this, several times Peter was pushed up against the wall. Things would go from bad to worse for Peter, though, that night. As he sat in a heavy wooden chair, it suddenly levitated several feet off the ground and then threw Peter on the floor. The chair came down on him, and both officers had to lift it off him as it was so heavy. The activity continued all evening, with pictures falling off the wall, doors opening by themselves, and furniture levitating. The next day, Officer Crawford would stop by the apartment complex once again with Officer Richard College. Coincidentally, they were called over once again for a domestic disturbance report. That night, a man was arrested at the scene, and College would take him, putting him in the back of the police vehicle. As College was walking him to the car, a woman ran over to Officer Crawford and told him something bizarre was happening at the Page home. The woman informed him a bed was levitating by itself in the apartment. Crawford ran and grabbed College, and the two men rushed in the apartment. However, the bed had already fallen back down to the floor. In the apartment, the men talked with the Pages, and soon the paranormal activity would restart. It didn't appear to be as extreme as the night before, so the police left and informed the Pages they would check on them every night. Then, 5 days later, from when Officer Crawford first came to the home, the Pages would call the police. Several officers, as well as family of the Pages, showed up and saw the paranormal activity. At this point, there were multiple witnesses to the event, and the story was soon picked up by the press. The newspaper in the area, named The Standard, wrote an article titled "Ghostly Presence in an Apartment" on Church Street. It detailed what was happening in the apartment, and the story spread like wildfire. More reporters, paranormal investigators, and others arrived at the apartment. The Pages didn't like the attention and eventually went to Montreal for a short time. Once the attention calmed down, they returned to their apartment. Interestingly, in Montreal, no paranormal activity occurred. In addition, when they returned, there were no more reports of supernatural behavior. The family never went public and never talked about the event. The records from this story come from other eyewitnesses, such as Officer Crawford, and newspaper reports. Despite the short duration of the haunting, this case is considered to be highly legit by paranormal investigators. This is due to the large number of independent witnesses, many whom are deemed very credible. In addition, the family avoided the spotlight and never tried to gain money or fame from the story. Over the years, there's been much speculation around this case. It appears by all accounts that this was a poltergeist haunting. The spirit displayed the classic symptoms of a poltergeist by disturbing objects and also never manifesting. In addition, one person seemed to be at the center of the haunting, Peter. It's not clear why the haunting abruptly stopped and why it was so short too. Still, other poltergeist cases have been very short like this, and sometimes cases can last for years. One other question concerns why it started in the first place. No reason has ever been discovered. The apartment complex would eventually be repurposed from residential housing to commercial housing. It exchanged hands multiple times, including being converted to a pizzeria. All tenants reported no strange activity, and it appears now whatever haunted this property has moved on. On November 7th, 1990, an American woman visiting Montreal, Canada, ascended to the rooftop of the towering Bonaventure Hotel. The hotel had a rooftop pool with incredible views of the city. As she backstroked through the pool, she would turn around and see something unbelievable in the sky. She didn't know it at the time, but the woman was about to become the first witness to one of Canada's most renowned UFO sightings. This case features multiple reliable witnesses, photographic evidence, and is considered extremely credible even outside the UFO community. Even more intriguing, the craft was gigantic, estimated to be around 500 yards long. In this episode, we will dive into a UFO sighting that has come to be known as the 1990 Hotel Bonaventure UFO sighting. Around 7:15 on November 7th, 1990, an American tourist hopped into the heated rooftop pool at the Hotel Bonaventure in Montreal, Canada. The rooftop pool was surrounded by gorgeous gardens and also was renowned for having amazing views of the city. After a few minutes, the woman glanced up at the night sky and saw something strange. It was like nothing she had ever seen before. Just over by the stock market building, a massive silver disc was hovering above it, around 8,000 feet in the air. The disc was surrounded by lights that were green, amber, and yellow. It's important to note here the craft was massive, estimated to be around 500 yards long, but the lights were mostly centered over the stock market building. Incredibly, as if the UFO knew she had seen it, the massive craft began hovering over toward the Bonaventure Hotel. The craft was completely silent at this time, and the woman stared in amazement. Reports vary as to what happened next. Some say the woman swam over toward the lifeguard and told her about the craft. Other reports indicate the lifeguard saw the UFO as it hovered over, and the two simply began discussing what it could be. Our best guess is that the lifeguard did see it as it came over. After the two discussed what it could be, the lifeguard decided to radio down to hotel security. Word spread around the hotel, and soon around 30 people ascended to the rooftop. This includes hotel staff, guests, and eventually police. The large group watched in awe and debated what the object could be. The lights appeared to grow a bit brighter from time to time, and this concerned hotel security. They believed this might be some sort of signal of an attack that was going to come. As such, they contacted the Montreal police, and soon Officer Francois Lip arrived at the scene. Lip had no idea what the craft was and how they should handle the situation. He would radio for backup, and soon more officers arrived at the scene. Police Chief Robert Masson was one of the men who came to the hotel. Masson was baffled too, but decided it was possible it could be some sort of optical illusion. As such, he had spotlights from a nearby construction site turned off. However, after this, the UFO was still visible. Masson would also call the military and airport. Officials at the airport stated there were no objects on the radar screen in that area. We know the object should have shown up on radar though. This is because sometime during the night, a cargo plane flew between the St. Bonaventure Hotel and the UFO. The cargo plane was flying at 6,000 feet and was visible on the airport radar. Masson estimated the UFO to be about 8,000 feet in the air. As far as the military response, they alleged to not see anything either on their systems. We will dive into the military and their response in just a bit. Around 9 p.m., a journalist named Marcel Laroche arrived at the building. He photographed the craft, and while his photos definitely helped support the case, unfortunately around 9 p.m., it began to get cloudy and foggy in the city. In other words, if Laroche had arrived an hour earlier, we would have some incredibly clear photos of the craft. Sometime around 10:15 p.m., the clouds began to thicken and the UFO would disappear. The craft had remained over the city for at least 3 hours and had been witnessed by a number of professionals. In addition to this, hundreds, possibly thousands around the city saw the lights and UFO as well. There were many undocumented witness sightings of this strange craft. The next day after the event, the story spread like wildfire and investigators got to work. Witnesses were interviewed, Photos were analyzed and possible explanations were explored. The result, though, was simple. There was no logical explanation. Many examined this case, and perhaps the most interesting and comprehensive report was a 25-page document called Details Surrounding a Large Stationary Object over Montreal, written by UFO researcher Bernard Gounet and Richard F. Haynes, a former scientist with NASA. The report concludes that a massive object, probably around 530 meters, hovered over Montreal on that evening. The two men conclude in the paper that the evidence for the existence of a highly unusual hovering silent large object is indisputable. Coming back to the military response on the night in question, soon after the event, there was a considerable effort to collect any info around the event. Anything the government collected they classified as top secret. Still, the cat was out of the bag as the photos were published, and there were simply too many witnesses to do damage control. In the years after the event, Police Chief Masson stated that during this time he was reportedly stonewalled by the military. It's reasonable to assume they knew much more than they stated, and also possibly this was some type of experimental craft. Switching gears, what do skeptics say about the night in question? Skeptics typically state this was a weather phenomenon. However, this argument is easily dismissed. First, a solid object was spotted, and it was seen moving. Optical illusions typically don't float across the sky and stop. In addition to this, there were lights, and the lights fluctuated in brightness, which is not a characteristic of strange weather phenomenon. Many people spotted the craft, and not just the witnesses at the hotel. It was visible at least 3 hours. We should point out too that this event happened in 1990, and UFOs at the time were still considered very fringe. So what was this strange massive craft? In general, there are 2 theories. The first is that this was a military craft. Supporters of this theory point out the defiance by the military and also their confiscation of documents. However, this theory does have several glaring weaknesses. The first is the craft was said to be massive, around a mile long. It's tough to imagine in 1990 that the Canadian military would be in possession of such an aircraft. A second weakness in the military theory is that it doesn't make sense why they would be flying over a major metro area with a top secret craft. This leads to the second theory, and that this UFO was not of this world. This is the viewpoint of Police Chief Masson and many others who saw the UFO that night. The massive craft floated silently for hours, and this surely seems like ET technology. From here, there are 2 interesting angles to explore concerning this event. The first is the sheer size of the craft. Although rare, UFO sightings of massive city-sized crafts are not unheard of. One such case is the 1983 Alabama UFO sighting, an incident we covered years ago on this channel. In that case, a witness spotted a massive UFO, which she estimated to be about 7 to 8 stories high and 210 feet wide. In that case, the craft moved toward her about 4 to 5 miles per hour. A second case we covered on this channel, and a well-known one, is the 1942 Battle of Los Angeles. While it sounds like an 80s action flick, the event was very real and involved a massive UFO. In February 1942, LA was in a state of heightened security as the US was in World War II, and LA was stated to possibly be an enemy target. Sometime in February, a massive craft hovered over the city in the middle of the night. Believing it to be a Japanese attack, the military attacked the craft, doing no damage to the UFO, but causing much damage as shells and bullets rained down in the city. Many citizens witnessed this massive UFO that night. One other interesting angle to explore from this case is the UFO flying over a populated city. Once again, though, we have seen this. Just 4 years after this event, a UFO would fly above the skyscrapers in Plön, Germany. It is important to note that in this case the craft wasn't huge, but it did fly much closer to the buildings and even between them. Other cases of UFOs going into urban areas have been documented as well. Probably the most famous case of this happening was the Linda Napolitano alien abduction, a case where a Manhattan woman stated she was taken from her New York apartment in the middle of the night. Other witnesses stated they saw the craft that night, and also Linda levitating into the ship around 2 o'clock in the morning. These types of cases raise all sorts of interesting questions around why these beings are in such heavy populated areas, and perhaps more importantly, why they are okay with being spotted. As many of you know, the majority of the time, UFOs are spotted in desolate areas and often at night. There's a few theories why they might be doing this. The first is that the UFO wanted to appear invisible or camouflaged, but something malfunctioned, causing it to be visible. There are numerous reports of these crafts vanishing right in front of witnesses' eyes. This leads some to believe they do travel around heavy populated areas and observe what mankind is doing. We covered a case from Canada recently in which a hospital worker spotted a craft on top of another building. By all accounts, it seemed the UFO was having mechanical issues. A second theory from some is the UFO was doing some type of experiment as to gauge our reaction. This seems plausible, especially based on the behavior of the craft. One theory is that the craft was being piloted by a rogue operator. Could a disgruntled alien broken the rules and took its ship into a heavy populated area? Perhaps some beings want to come out of the shadows and connect with humans, but leadership will not allow it. One final theory is that when these crafts come into heavy populated areas, they are military crafts or perhaps a crashed UFO that is rebuilt by humans and operated by humans. Perhaps these are experiments run by the government to gauge the public's readiness to learn the truth. Could this massive UFO over the hotel actually been an ET craft piloted by military? It seems possible, but unlikely. In sum, was this case credible? Yes, it is an extremely credible case for several reasons. First, there were multiple witnesses who saw the UFO from multiple angles. Second, the craft was massive, which pretty much rules out it being man-made or a secret military operation. Third, there was photographic evidence. Finally, there are no other logical explanations, except possibly this craft was from another dimension. While this case was a fascinating one, Montreal is a hotspot for UFO activity. We will do a whole episode on the topic and some of these interesting cases, so stay tuned. In 1983, Mary M. Landell, who resided on Lake Erie at the time, walked out onto her front porch as the sun was rising. That morning, the lake was calm and peaceful. That would soon change, though. Miss Landell would look out onto the lake and see what she believed was a boat that had capsized. However, upon further inspection, she saw some type of monster. It had a brownish green color and was 40 to 50 feet long. She saw a long neck protruding from the water, as well as the eye on the side of the head. The creature would disappear under the surface of Lake Erie. That day, Mary Landell would see what came to be known as the Lake Erie Monster, or Bessie. Bessie is described as resembling a plesiosaur, which were aquatic reptiles that went extinct millions of years ago. Like many water cryptids, the size of the beast has varied with different eyewitness reports, some around 20 feet, while others say it is about 60 feet long. Bessie is described as being bluish-gray with a long neck on many occasions, but also has been seen to be more greenish-brown. With so many people out on the lake today, it's tough to imagine such a large beast could reside undetected. Surprisingly, though, there are a good number of sightings that have occurred over the centuries. Just 2 years before Mary saw Bessie, Teresa Kovac would spot something in the water. In 1981, Kovac would spot a snake-like reptile. She noted it seemed to be playing and was so large it could have knocked over a boat. In 1985, Tony Schill was out on a boat in Lake Erie when he would spot a strange creature. He saw 5 humps protruding from the water, and the experienced fisherman would later say that no way was it a sturgeon. That same year in the summer, Dale Munro would spot Bessie off the Lorraine Coast Guard station. He stated the beast was at least twice the size of his boat, which was 16 feet. He described the beast as black and watched it for 4 minutes. One interesting finding occurred in 1989. A fish finder would record something truly strange. Streetboro resident Ken Smith would record something 35 feet in length, around 30 feet deep. It was cigar-shaped. In 1990, Harold Brickett and his family were fishing when they would see a massive creature in the water. They were just north of Cedar Point Amusement Park when they would spot a serpent-like creature in the water. Brickett would report it swam along with their boat and was around 35 feet in length. On September 11th, 1990, 2 fire inspectors, Jim Johnson and Steve Dirks, would spot Bessie. Although the men were inside and looking at the creature from a 3rd-story window, they watched the beast for quite some time. They noted multiple parts of the creature were above water, and it was black around 35 feet. While these are some of the better-known sightings in modern day, it's important to point out that many existed as well in prior decades. The first documented sighting of this cryptid occurred in 1793. Then, just north of Sandusky, Ohio, a captain on a ship named Felicity was duck hunting. He fired a shot and suddenly a large creature began thrashing around his boat. It must have surprised the creature as it momentarily surfaced. The captain said the creature was at least 25 feet long. In 1817, there would be several more sightings. In July, a crew out on the water would spot a monster at least 30 feet. None of the crew could identify what it was. Sometime that same year, another ship would report a similar sighting, a large creature appearing snake-like and having a dark color. Sometime later, in 1817, 2 brothers would spot a massive creature on the beach of Lake Erie. It was around 20 to 30 feet in size and appeared to be just about ready to die. The brothers were familiar with the aquatic life in the water and compared the animal to a sturgeon, although it wasn't a sturgeon since it had arms. The brothers fled, and when they returned, the creature was nowhere to be seen. In July 1892, a ship traveling through Lake Erie would spot Bessie. In the distance ahead, a captain and his crew would spot a large creature in the water. When they got closer, they got a much better look. The creature would rise up out of the water, its head several feet out. The crew estimated Bessie to be about 50 feet long and have a circumference of around 4 feet. In May 1896, a group of witnesses would report seeing Bessie off Crystal Beach. The witnesses said they watched Bessie for around 30 to 45 minutes, and that it had a dog-like head. As we see, there's certainly been a large number of sightings of Bessie. Located on the border of Canada and the United States, Lake Erie is the smallest of the 5 Great Lakes. It is relatively shallow, going only around 200 feet deep at the deepest part, and averaging around 60 throughout the lake. Still, while compared to other lakes, it is the 11th largest lake in the world and has around 800 miles of shoreline. At its widest point, it is around 57 miles across. Interestingly, the lake is said to house thousands of shipwrecks, with many speculated to be well preserved. All this raises the question around whether this cryptid could exist. It doesn't seem as clear-cut as other cases that this creature does exist. However, there have been a large number of sightings, and while some were surely mistaken identity, others had multiple witnesses and surely saw something. Over the years, there's been several theories proposed. One is that the witnesses misidentified what they saw. It's very possible and likely some of the witnesses saw either an eel or a snake. One possibility is a sturgeon. Sturgeons breach the water and do a tail walk in a pose that makes it look like the neck and head of a sea serpent. The fish never stop growing, and the average size is about 5 feet, with reports of the fish growing up to 10 to 12 feet. Other possibilities include moose or a bear. It's been photographed that multiple moose crossing water can appear as humps. Still, it's unlikely a moose or a bear would be in the middle of the lake, as they probably only swim in areas of the lake that are not wide across. One other possibility is a school of fish. These will appear black, although they definitely cannot protrude out of the water. For those who believe this is not a known animal, there are generally two theories. One is that this is a new species, one that may have evolved from something else. This raises questions around how they evaded detection for so long, though. One thought is the creature is nocturnal and limits its exposure to daylight. The second theory says that the creature is a surviving prehistoric creature. Perhaps Bessie is a species that somehow survived extinction. The final theory around Bessie is a hybrid theory. This stipulates that some sightings were legit, while others were cases of mistaken identity. Perhaps this creature lived in the lake for centuries, but then began to die out in the mid-20th century. With the locals familiar about the monster, they may have started looking for things that weren't there. We know gauging size and objects in the water is very difficult. Often witnesses only get a glance for a few seconds at something. In addition, it's possible that other animals, such as a moose or a bear, could have been in the water. While several cases, if true, clearly demonstrate that something has been in the water, there doesn't appear to be one ironclad sighting that can't somewhat be scrutinized. For that, in our opinion, you would need a modern-day sighting with multiple independent witnesses and seeing a close visual of the head and part of the body out of the water for at least a few seconds. Most of the eyewitness accounts have one or two of these characteristics, but not all. Still, like many other water cryptids, it's very possible that something remains hidden, or at least at one time existed under the surface of Lake Erie. We've covered numerous cases on this channel of UFO crashes and cover-ups. Many scoff at the idea that beings with such advanced technology and that have traveled great distances could break down or crash so easily. However, we see quite a number of cases of not only UFOs crashing, but also experiencing mechanical failure and sometimes even accidentally showing themselves. In today's episode, we will cover a case from Canada that happened in 1970, an incident known as the Cowichan Hospital UFO sighting. On New Year's Day in 1970, in Cowichan District Hospital on Vancouver Island, Canada, a nurse would have an experience that would change her life forever. Around 5 a.m. in the morning, a practical nurse named Doreen Kendall was checking on her patients when she would notice an older gentleman was having difficulty sleeping. After checking over him, Doreen realized he was hot and decided to open the drapes to let some air in. As she began opening them, immediately a bright white light hit her in the face. Doreen spotted a bright object about 50 feet across, hovering over the children's ward. It was silver and shaped like a bowl on the bottom. The top had a transparent dome and, interestingly, was completely lit up inside. Being only around 60 feet away, Doreen could see right inside the craft. There were two humanoids, or beings, that looked like men. The beings were wearing a one-piece tight-fitted outfit and were standing one behind the other, turned to the side, and standing in front of what looked like a control device. The one in the front appeared taller, or was positioned higher than the other, though they both appeared to be in the range of 6 feet in height. Their heads were encased in close-fitting, dark material. Doreen would later state they looked like fine, tall, well-built men. They were dressed in tight-fitting suits of the same material that covered their heads, but their hands were bare, and I noticed how human they looked. Their flesh seemed just like ours. Based on Doreen's observation, they seemed to be trying to fix something, and it was as if their controls had broke. Doreen would later state the man in front was staring at the panel as if something very important was going on, and I wondered if they might have had mechanical trouble. I even thought they might have landed on the roof of the hospital and then had trouble taking off. Soon the craft would begin to tilt, and it got to the point where Doreen could see just below the knees of the aliens. She noticed they were standing as well in front of what looked like stools. Inside the craft, Doreen would spot some panels. The panels in the dome were very large, taking up almost half the interior of it and reaching nearly to the top. The instruments, if that is what they were, seemed to be inset in the chrome-like material of the panels, and there was a variety of sizes. While she was watching them, Doreen felt a sense of calm and peace over her. It was surreal for her, and she forgot about what was going on in the room at the time. She stated she'd never felt so peaceful, and that she wished she could have communicated with them. As she kept watching them, she began to think to herself that she shouldn't move or turn around, as it may alert the beings. Right as she did this, though, one of the beings, the being in the rear, turned and faced her. It was as if the being was able to read her thoughts. Doreen would later state, "He seemed to look right at me, but I couldn't see his face. It was covered by a darkish material that looked softer than the rest of his suit. I'm sure he saw me, because then he touched the other man on the back. When he did this, the man in the front reached down and took hold of something like a lever beside him. I'll never forget how deliberately he did it. He pushed it back and forth, and the saucer, or whatever you called it, started to circle slowly, still close to the building, in an anti-clockwise direction. After the UFO started spinning, Doreen would fall out of her trance-like state and turn around to speak to the other nurse in the room, Miss Frida Wilson. Miss Wilson would later state, "I noticed Miss Kendall standing at the window and wondered what she was looking at. In fact, I was just going to see when she beckoned to me, and then I saw this great big light over the patio outside the children's ward. I'd say it was quite a bit larger than a car. It looked circular in shape, and the far side seemed to be higher than the side near to us. It was moving around slowly, and then it started to move away. I didn't really see any top or bottom to it. It was all just tremendously bright." The two women then ran to the nurses' station and told 3 other nurses about the sighting. The 5 nurses then all ran back to the window. At this time, though, the craft was a good distance away from them and just appeared as a bright light. Interestingly, the object did circle the hospital several times before vanishing to the northeast at incredible speeds. What can we make of this UFO sighting? It seems like a pretty credible sighting in general. There were multiple witnesses, and the craft is one that has been reported on several occasions. It appears that Doreen might have spotted Nordic aliens or possibly robotic beings. As stated, the entities seem to be having some sort of mechanical trouble based on what Doreen saw. While it didn't stop them from taking off, and maybe they did fix it, another theory around the mechanical failure is that it might have been around the craft not being able to cloak itself and appear invisible. Many speculate UFOs are able to travel through our skies undetected by appearing invisible. They only reveal their ship when out in desolate areas or when mechanical failures occur. There's many good reasons to think these beings could be traveling around heavily populated areas completely undetected. One other interesting facet of this case is that Doreen reported feelings of happiness and peace when seeing the craft. There are other cases where individuals who come into contact with UFOs and extraterrestrials report feelings of extreme happiness and love. These individuals, or experiencers, report positive experiences, and many even hope to have additional contact again. Of course, on the other end of the spectrum are those that are taken against their will and report extremely terrifying experiences. Still, this raises another issue we see quite often around control. Based on a number of cases, these entities seem to be able to clearly control the emotions and thoughts of people in close encounters. Many times it appears they are able to block certain memories and create overwhelming feelings of happiness and joy. Some speculate the beings might actually be able to manipulate neurotransmitters in the human brain like dopamine and serotonin, which are associated with happiness and pleasure. One other theory is that there are numerous alien races visiting our planet. It seems, based on all the reports received, this could be possible too. The idea raises all sorts of interesting questions. What is the dominant alien race? Are any species protecting us? Is there some sort of alien hierarchy? Or does each species pretty much get to do what it wants? These are complex and tough questions that we might not ever get the answer to. Let's hope, though, that one day we will find answers. We've covered numerous alien abduction cases on this channel of abductees reporting being taken multiple times over their lifetime. Often the abductions start in childhood and continue throughout one's life. Perhaps most unsettling, though, is that sometimes other family members are taken too. In this episode, we will cover a frightening alien abduction case that happened in Canada in 2003. This is the true story of Corina Saebels. Like many other alien abductees, Corina Saebels wasn't someone who lived her life investigating UFOs. She was a mother, a busy professional, and by all accounts, a respected member of her community. In 2003, she was living in Kelowna, British Columbia in Canada, and living a pretty normal life. Despite her busy life, though, deep down, Corina harbored a secret. She believed something had been happening to her since she was a child. She experienced missing time, strange dreams, and unexplained marks on her body, as well as memories that didn't feel like dreams. Like many, she kept quiet and wanted to just live her life. However, on the night of July 31st, everything would change. On that night, Corina was at home with her son and dogs, hanging out in the common room. Everything seemed normal, and it was quiet outside. Then, all of a sudden, a blinding white light flooded the house. It wasn't like any light she had ever seen before, though. It was controlled, steady, and incredibly bright. Her son screamed and her dogs went wild, barking uncontrollably. Then Corina felt something she had felt before, a sudden, overwhelming paralysis. She tried to move, but she couldn't. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Then the next thing she remembers was being outside. She wasn't standing, though. She was floating, being pulled upward toward a craft hovering silently above the neighborhood. This is a characteristic we see in many other alien abduction cases. Often abductees will recall being floated through a wall or a ceiling. While Corina didn't recall that exact detail, she did remember as she floated up toward the craft, she was surrounded by several small gray aliens. They were around 3 to 4 feet tall, with large heads, thin bodies, and huge black eyes. Once inside the craft, she was in a bright white room and was laying on a metallic table. She didn't remember consciously what they did, but did seem to recall or had a feeling she was being examined. She recalled seeing instruments and communicating telepathically with the beings. She couldn't remember the details of what was communicated, and at some point, she blacked out. Corina woke up hours later back in her home, disoriented and terrified. Her son was crying and her dogs were still barking and angry. Corina checked on her son and he as well stated he didn't remember the last several hours. This event appeared to be the straw that broke the camel's back, and Corina was now ready to come forward and discuss her story, hoping to find some answers. Before diving into the investigation, it should be noted there was additional evidence that something had happened. First, and a critical piece of evidence was that her neighbor also reported seeing a bright light over the house that night. In addition, when Corina checked the house and the yard, she found a burn mark on the lawn where the light had been. In addition to that, there was a strange metallic smell lingering in the air. And finally, like we see often, she had marks on her body that she couldn't explain. In sum, this wasn't just a dream or sleep paralysis. Something had happened, and Corina wanted answers. She reached out to the UFO community, and her case quickly drew attention from investigators, including those who did the documentary The Visitors, where her story was explored in detail. Later, she underwent hypnotic regression, which revealed more memories, including grays, performing procedures, telepathic communication, and a strong sense that she had been taken many times before. Her story is considered quite credible, as various investigators noted her consistency retelling the story, her emotional responses, and of course the neighbors seeing the light and the physical evidence around her home. Skeptics argued sleep paralysis, hallucination, or misinterpretation were probably why she believed she was taken. However, believers noted there were multiple witnesses, the burn marks, and the shared missing time as indicators that something extraordinary occurred. As mentioned, the 2003 abduction wasn't an isolated event. Corina believed she had been taken many times throughout her life, starting in childhood. She described memories of waking up with unexplained scars and bruises. Also, she recalled seeing beings in a room and instances of missing hours of time. She also had dreams that felt more like memories. Her story fits a pattern seen in many abduction cases, in that she had lifelong contact with non-human entities, and also her son was taken as well. There are numerous cases of bloodlines being abducted. Is this case credible? I believe this is a credible case. Although she did undergo hypnosis, she had conscious memories of many of the events, albeit her memories are somewhat fuzzy. There was also quite a bit of physical evidence, including the scars and burn marks too. Perhaps the best evidence, though, comes from the neighbor corroborating the story. It's not known what happened to Corina Saebels and her son, and how they are doing these days. There doesn't appear to be any newer videos or articles indicating whether they had any new experiences. Let's hope, though, that Corina and her son have not, and they have been able to move on with their lives. On May 20th, 1967, around 10:15 p.m., a 51-year-old man stumbled into Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg, Canada. The individual was extremely sick and had been constantly vomiting the last few hours. The hospital staff began helping him, and as they opened his shirt, they noticed some strange burn marks. No one knew it at the time, but the individual, Stephen Michalak, had just had one of the most famous UFO sightings in the history of Canada. In this episode, we will dive into this popular close encounter of the second kind, an incident now known as the Falcon Lake Incident. On May 19, 1967, Stephen Michalak, a mechanic, departed his home in Winnipeg to Falcon Lake in order to search for silver and quartz. Stephen was an amateur prospector and had had some good luck the prior year staking some claims. On the evening of May 19th, Steve checked into a motel on the Trans-Canada Highway with plans to wake up early the next day and head into Whiteshell Park. The next day around 5:30 a.m., Stephen departed the motel and arrived in the park around 9 a.m. He soon settled near a stream and got to work studying the quartz formation. At 11 o'clock, Stephen ate lunch, and then at 12:15 p.m., Stephen heard a flock of geese honking, so he got up and turned around. Then he would see them. Up in the sky, there were 2 red, glowing, cigar-shaped UFOs around 150 feet away. What happened next was something really interesting. The objects descended, and as they did, their shape seemed to change as well. They went from being cigar-shaped to oval-shaped to finally disc-shaped. One craft remained hovering, while another landed on a rock about 150 feet away. At the time, Steve began sketching the crafts. Then the UFO hovering began to ascend. Like we see from time to time, the colors on the craft change, going from red to orange to finally gray. In just a few moments, the craft disappeared somewhere in the clouds. Still, the other craft remained, and it had changed colors as well, going from a red to a silver color with a faint gold light around it. The craft was giving off a sulfur-like smell and made a buzzing sound, something we see in a number of cases. For around 30 minutes, Steve watched the object and even sketched it. He believed it was a military craft and decided to remain where he was. Then a door opened on the side of the UFO, and Steven began to approach. When he got within about 60 feet, he heard, or believed he heard, human voices. He kept walking toward the 35-foot craft and spoke out in English, attempting to communicate. There was no response, though. He would try as well in several other languages, like German and Russian, but to no avail. Finally, he reached the craft and decided to peek inside the open door. There were many various colored lights inside flashing, but he didn't see anyone, human or alien. He then stepped back out of the craft, and unexpectedly, the door closed. At this point, Steve took notice of the craft. There were no screws or any type of seam anywhere. It was just one smooth surface. Curious, Steve, who was still wearing his protective gear, reached out and touched the UFO, and it melted his glove. Then the craft spun somehow, and some type of vent was in front of him. It was about 9 inches high and 6 inches wide and had round holes. Unexpectedly, a blast of air or gas shot out from the vent, setting his shirt and undershirt on fire. In pain, Steve scrambled to undress and put out the fire. Meanwhile, the craft began to ascend, and just like the first craft, it changed colors in the same fashion. Steve continued to smell the sulfur-like smell, and soon he became violently ill. He felt nauseous and started breaking out in cold sweats. He quickly decided it was time to head back to the motel. On his way back, he threw up several times. Soon he reached the highway and would be stopped by Constable G.A. Solotki of the Falcon Beach Highway Patrol. It was around 3 p.m. at the time, and Stephen warned the officer to not get too close, as he believed he had radiation poisoning. He kept his shirt in his briefcase for this reason. Stephen would go on to tell the officer his story, and as we will see, reports seem to vary as to what happened next. The police report indicates that Constable Solotki believed Stephen might be drunk, albeit he did not smell alcohol on him. He also thought it was strange he had no prospecting equipment, although it's reasonable to assume, being so sick, he just left it behind. Perhaps where the accounts differ the most significantly is whether the officer was willing to help. According to the police report, Solotki offered to take him in for medical treatment, but Stephen refused. By some accounts, the officer was reluctant or unwilling to help him, and that's when he moved on. Also, another point of disagreement seems to be around Steve answering his questions. According to critics, Steve was unwilling to answer many of the constable's questions, leading some to theorize he was hiding something or lying. Of course, according to Steve, he believed he had been exposed to radioactive material and was just trying to protect the man. While we don't know for sure everything that happened in the interaction, we do know that Steve soon got on a bus that evening and headed back to Winnipeg. His son would meet him at the bus terminal in Winnipeg and take him to the hospital. There, he was treated for first-degree burns. After being discharged from the hospital, Stephen contacted the Winnipeg Tribune and told him his story. The paper ran the story, and soon it spread like wildfire around the country. Just 3 days after the event, the APRO would show up to Steve's house to talk with him. In addition, that same day, the police would show up too and noted his burnt hat and damaged welding goggles. At this point, Steve was still very sick and had lost 13 pounds in 3 days. The vomiting had not stopped, nor had the nausea. Many would visit him from various branches of the government, as well as reporters. Some believed him, while others didn't. Perhaps the most notable encounter happened with the Air Force. On May 26, Air Force officials showed up at Steve's door demanding to know where the landing site was. Steven initially refused, stating he didn't want to make his prospecting spot public. Still, officials took his soil sample and tested it, and it was found to be highly radioactive. Realizing how dangerous the situation had now become, Steve decided he needed to show the Air Force the landing spot. Once he took them there, authorities noted the burnt moss. Reports vary here, with some stating significant amounts of radiation were not found, albeit there were traces of it present, while others state the area and objects were found to be very radioactive. It seems many of the objects were passed around different government agencies and eventually lost, leading to more questions. In January 1968, Stevens Burns would return. As a result, the Winnipeg Tribune decided to run a story on it. In the story, the paper would publish what is perhaps the most famous photo of a close encounter of the second kind in human history. Steven is shown laying in a hospital bed with burnt grid marks in his chest. It's important to note this photo has been highly criticized by skeptics. In fact, many sources have dated this photo to be from May 1967. However, the burn marks from 1967 seem to be different, larger, and more circular. There is more to the story than this, though, and we will examine this argument from skeptics in just a moment. Still, what can we make of this case? Is it credible? In our opinion, it seems more likely than not this event happened, albeit it's not as credible as many other cases we have covered. To begin, let's examine several of the skeptic arguments. The first and weakest seems to be that Steven was drinking or hungover and that he simply created the story. Several hotel employees alleged to have seen him drinking a few beers the night before. Steven did deny this, but even if he had some beers, who cares? His interaction with the cop didn't suggest that he was drinking. The second criticism comes from critics, and that is that Steven created the story in order to prevent others from finding his prospecting spot. This argument is flimsy at best as well. This is because creating a story like this would just attract more people to the area. In addition, Steven's health was terrible, and this caused him to lose valuable prospecting days. The third claim from skeptics is that Steven created the story for fame and fortune. This isn't a terrible argument, as Steve did contact the papers and also wrote a pamphlet on his experience. Still, it is our opinion he was negligent as to what would happen to him and his family. He was trying to let others know what happened to him so they wouldn't have to go through the same experience he did. The final argument from critics is around the burns. The first is that the burn pattern from January 1968 appears to be different from the May 1967 photo. In our opinion, this is the strongest argument from critics. However, like critics do all too often, they leave out details. Initially, the red blotchy marks appeared, but then several days later, they turned into the gridiron burn marks and matched the 1968 photo. It's important to point out too that Steve's shirt had the grid burn marks on them as well, and there's photographic evidence of this. Also, this raises the question, if the burns were so different, and if Steve fabricated the story, why would he go public with this second set of burns? It really doesn't make sense on the surface. All this said, there are some legit reasons to believe Steven. First off, he was a Polish immigrant worker, and it seems tough to believe he would be able to trick so many people. The case was investigated by many, and other than the burn photos, nothing else seems to suggest he created the story. The second reason was Steve's health. Without question, Steve had horrible burn marks and was violently ill for some time. It's tough to imagine that he would purposely burn and injure himself for a little bit of fame. After all, Steve was on the brink of some big prospecting discoveries. It makes sense that he would want to be out in the woods searching as much as possible. The final thing to support Stephen's story was the radiation found. With the soil sample, it was found to be highly radioactive, and this was the government testing it, not a researcher hired from a UFO organization. That said, many will criticize and state there was just trace radiation on the site, but it's surely possible this was covered up. More evidence seems to come from Steve's son, who wrote a book on the topic. He recalled his experience seeing his dad in bed at age 9. He would state in his book, "When I walked into the bedroom, there was a huge stink in the room, like a horrible aroma of sulfur and burnt motor. It was all around, and it was coming out of his pores. It was bad." His son would also state, "If Dad hoaxed this, remember, we're talking about a blue-collar, industrial mechanic. If he hoaxed it, then he was a freaking genius." In 1999, Stephen Michalak died, never wavering on his story. In the fall of 1972, in Toronto, Canada, a group of 8 members from the Toronto Society for Physical Research conducted a seance that would have a profound impact on the field of parapsychology. 8 individuals, none with psychic or telekinetic abilities, would receive communication after summoning a spirit named Phillip. While the results seemed to provide credibility for paranormal activity in seances, it did not. The reason being, Phillip was never actually a person, but a fictitious individual created by members of the group. In time, the results would be duplicated by others, and many theories have been proposed as to what exactly happened. In this episode, we will cover this fascinating experiment, an event that has come to be known as the 1972 Phillip experiment. In 1972, under the leadership of Dr. Arg Owen, he would gather 8 members from the Toronto Society for Physical Research, or TSPR, to see if it was possible to create a ghost. The idea was revolutionary, as many have speculated that ghosts or spirits exist only in the human mind. The idea behind Dr. Owen's experiment was simple: create a fictitious character and see if they could contact the spirit. The group would look for signs the spirit was present by communicating with it, and also even hoping to see an apparition. To begin, the group first had to create the fictional character, who they named Philip Aylesford. As such, the following is the life story of Philip.
Philip was an aristocratic Englishman, living in the middle 1600s at the time of Oliver Cromwell. He had been a supporter of the king, and was a Catholic. He was married to a beautiful but cold and frigid wife, Dorothea, the daughter of a neighbouring nobleman. One day, when out riding on the boundaries of his estates, Philip came across a gypsy encampment and saw there a beautiful dark-eyed girl, raven-haired gypsy girl, Margot, and fell instantly in love with her. He brought her back secretly to live in the gatehouse, near the stables of Deington Manor, his family home. For some time he kept his love nest secret, but eventually Dorothea, realizing he was keeping someone else there, found Margot and accused her of witchcraft and stealing her husband. Philip was too scared of losing his reputation and his possessions to protest at the trial of Margot, and she was convicted of witchcraft and burned at the stake. Philip was subsequently stricken with remorse that he had not tried to defend Margot and used to pace the battlements of Deington in despair. Finally, one morning his body was found at the bottom of the battlements, whence he had cast himself in a fit of agony and remorse. Philip died by this suicide in 1654.
In addition to this, the group had one member draw drawings of what Philip looked like. The group included some non-fictional elements in Philip's story too, such as Oliver Cromwell. Still, the majority of his story was fabricated, and now the group decided to see, could they conjure up this fictitious creation? The group had a complete mental picture of Philip, his life, and what he looked like. So in September 1972, the group began conducting sessions where they met informally discussed Phillip and his life. The hope was Phillip would try and communicate with them. For the first year, there was no communication. Occasionally, group members would allege to feel his presence, but that was it. After a year, the group decided it was time to change strategy. Instead of sitting in a well-lit room, they needed to replicate the environment from a seance. In addition to this, they collected objects from the time period when fictional Phillip was alive, and also posted paintings of the castle he lived in, and also what they believed he looked like. Soon after starting, one evening the group would finally get the communication they had hoped for. A bang on the table. Soon, the group began communicating with Phillip using 1 knock for yes, and 2 knocks for no. The early sessions were promising, and the seances would only get better. Phillip would soon start to perform incredible feats that couldn't be explained scientifically. For example, he was sliding a heavy table all around the room. On several occasions, he would make the table stand on one leg. Phillip could dim the lights instantly on command and also turn them back on. Group members frequently felt a cool breeze come across the table. Without question, Phillip, or whatever was there, had psychokinetic powers and had used them multiple times in front of the group. Perhaps even more interesting, throughout the seances, Phillip would fill in the gaps of his fictitious life the group had created. He communicated to the group his likes and dislikes. Interestingly, the sessions would also show that Phillip's knowledge seemed to be limited by the group's creation. For example, he knew of the figure Oliver Cromwell, as the group had discussed Cromwell. However, he wasn't able to answer other historical questions that a person from his time period would know. This profound implication we'll discuss later in the video. Soon the group would conduct a seance in front of around 50 people and also conduct several sessions, which they videotaped. The results of the seances were pretty incredible, with dozens of witnesses seeing the paranormal activity. This included the table levitating, knocks, and the lights flickering on command. While this was quite impressive, unfortunately the group did not achieve one of its primary goals, for Phillip to manifest. Despite this, the experiment was a big success, and the group decided to repeat it. They created a French spy named Lilith, a man named Sebastian, and once again they were able to communicate through knocks. Unfortunately though, there was once again no manifestation. Interestingly as well, an Australian group would replicate the experiments. The results of these experiments have led to numerous theories and thoughts over the years. The first theory, and most popular, is that the group all conjured up a different spirit, one that pretended to be Phillip. Many speculate that a demon or another evil spirit could have been communicating with the group. There's good reason to believe that this happened. There are numerous cases where individuals attempt to communicate with benevolent spirits, but actually end up conjuring something evil. We hear stories around this pretty often, with those who use Ouija boards and things like that. Did the group actually open some sort of gateway and something else came through? It surely seems possible. Critics will state this theory does have one flaw. Phillip's knowledge was limited to the group's creation. Wouldn't another spirit possess knowledge outside of it? The second theory is that we can create these spiritual beings or ghosts in our mind, and this is exactly what the group did. It seems the group proved that abnormal activity, or activity that is unexplainable by modern science, surely happened in this case. It brings in the question around consciousness, and whether consciousness is able to transcend the laws we know. Many speculate that consciousness and or the spirit keeps going once the physical body passes, and while the experiment didn't prove this, it certainly didn't hurt the argument. While most believe the first two theories, there are other theories too, such as the activity came from something like another dimension, or possibly an extraterrestrial life form. In our opinion, these theories, while not as popular, seem possible as well. One theory that critics have proposed is that someone in the group possessed telekinetic abilities, like Carrie from the 1979 Stephen King horror film. This theory states the person was able to do the knocks, move the table, and switch the lights off and on with their mind. Some critics have proposed this and stated that's why a manifestation never happened. The group has stressed no member had these abilities, though. In addition, we know from numerous poltergeist cases, spirits can be present and disruptive, but never manifest. In sum, the Phillip experiment was a massive success on a number of fronts. First, it showed that paranormal activity exists, and perhaps most importantly, that science doesn't have the answers to everything. Some have critiqued the studies and stated that it shows ghosts are only in our mind. However, the experiments weren't about ghosts, but unexplainable activity. The activity really happened. We don't know the why, how, or what caused this strange activity, but we do know it did occur. In sum, it seems there is still much we don't understand about this world. In 1970, Laurent Dumont, age 10 at the time, was fishing with his family out on Lake Manitoba in the Winnipeg province of Canada. As the day winded down and the family started heading back to shore, the family saw something in the water ahead. It wasn't a floating log, and it appeared as shiny black humps poking out just above the water. Dumont would say the skin texture resembled an orca. As they got closer, Dumont and his family, well aware of the legendary creature that inhabited the lake, became excited as they might finally be able to see the creature up close. Then, around 20 to 30 feet away, the creature dipped under the water and disappeared. Dumont and his family had came close to seeing the mysterious water creature said to inhabit Lake Manitoba, a creature that has become to be known as Manipogo. Manipogo is typically described as having a muddy brown body with humps that show above the water. Witnesses say the creature is around 12 to 50 feet in length, and some report it has a sheep-like or reptile-like head. It has been described as eel-like or snake-like in appearance. While many quickly dismiss Manipogo as folklore and a creature that never existed, there's quite a bit of evidence that something could have been in this lake, or perhaps still is. On Friday, August 18, 1961, a newspaper article written in the Calgary Herald details how many in the surrounding communities believed something was in the lake. Dr. James MacLeod, a university professor and head of zoology at the University of Manitoba, was convinced something was in the lake. In the article, it details how Dr. MacLeod spoke with many residents that witnessed the creature. The article states that every year since 1955, parties of swimmers, fishermen, and sightseers reported sighting the monster around late July or early August. Also, it mentions a strange, unknown bone discovered as well by resident Oscar Fredrickson. Later, the bone was said to be likely from an ancient sea monster that swam inland after the last ice age. Dr. MacLeod was convinced that the monster existed. He planned to use skin divers and large nets to search for it, but unfortunately wasn't able to find any hard evidence. It should be said the lake is fairly shallow at only around 23 feet, but with such a large lake and working in dark conditions, it's very reasonable to assume that skin divers could have easily missed hard evidence and also simply not even searched a good portion of the area. A year prior to Dr. MacLeod's search, perhaps the most famous sighting of the beast would occur in 1960. On August 10th, 1960, 17 people said they saw 3 creatures swimming in the water. It's reported many of the witnesses didn't know one another, but all never wavered in their story. One of the witnesses that day, Tom Locke, a land inspector, would dub the name of the creature as Manipogo. Another popular sighting that occurred in the early 1960s occurred in 1962. 2 fishermen, Richard Vincent and John Conefall, alleged to have seen a large monster similar to a serpent or giant snake. The men were on their boat on Lake Manitoba near the mouth of the Waterhen River. Vincent took a photo of the sighting, and to date this appears to be the only alleged photo of Manipogo. Although sightings date back to the 1800s, the first documented sighting was reported in 1909 by Hudson Bay's Company's fur trader Valentine Mackay, who says he saw a massive snake-like creature. Still, other documented sightings occurred as well in modern day. In 1989, Sean Smith and his family were visiting from Minneapolis, Minnesota. They were on a camping trip and stayed at Shallow Point off Highway number 6 on Lake Manitoba. While on the lake, Smith says they saw a creature about 80 feet in length with many humps coming from the water. In 1997, campers from Quebec who were on Lundar Beach campground alleged to see a large reptile head rise above the water and then disappear below the surface. The creature was several hundred feet offshore, but still panic ensued and swimmers evacuated the water. The official statement was that the object was a log, but a search of the area didn't find this. In 2004, commercial fisherman Keith Hayden reported some of his fishing nets on Lake Manitoba were torn up by something even more strange. The fish in the nets weren't nibbled on, but were actually bitten in half. This, of course, raised the question as to what could actually do this. Lake Manitoba is located around 47 miles to the northwest of Winnipeg and is the 14th largest lake in Canada at 1,785 square miles, often overshadowed by the nearby massive Lake Winnipeg. Lake Manitoba is a popular spot for fishing, campers, and outdoorsmen. While many have come to the lake, some have reported seeing the creature in the water over the years. In fact, native tribes have told stories of the beast for centuries, and finally in 1960 the creature was named Manipogo in a tribute to the more famous Canadian cryptid water monster, Ogopogo. There are those that believe the monster is nothing more than wishful thinking. In 1959, local radio DJ Don Curtin got word about a sighting of Manipogo. He went and interviewed the witness and played it the next day. The interview was wildly popular, and soon many people were out in their boats looking for Manipogo. It's said in the area every summer Manipogo fever exists as sightings and the popularity of the creature explodes. There are several theories concerning Manipogo. The first is that Manipogo is simply a moose and its calf or calves. It's well documented that when moose and their calves travel through water, it can appear as humps in the water. Also, an individual moose could appear as humps if the head is above water as well as its humps. While this can explain some of the sightings, it surely cannot explain all of them though. For example, any sighting where the creature disappeared under the water for an extended period couldn't be a moose, as they obviously need oxygen. The second theory is that it could be a sturgeon. Sturgeons breach the water and do a tail walk in a pose that makes it look like the neck and head of a sea serpent. Sturgeon never stop growing and are the largest freshwater fish in Lake Manitoba. The average size is about 5 feet, though they can grow up to 7 or 8 feet at least. Another explanation is that it is simply an eel or snake, and that witnesses have misjudged the size. Other theories include that it is some type of prehistoric creature that survived the last ice age, or perhaps a new, reclusive species. Canada is renowned for its number of water cryptids, and Manipogo draws many comparisons to a water cryptid from British Columbia known as Ogopogo, said to inhabit Okanagan Lake. While no concrete evidence has ever been found, there has been numerous eyewitness sightings that have continued to present day. The community embraces the cryptid, and many, despite any evidence, believe something exists in the lake. On the night of December 29, 1980, 3 individuals would witness a massive UFO, and this event would change their lives forever. Unlike other UFO sightings, and even some abductions, the witnesses would suffer appalling injuries that would hinder their lives for years, and eventually lead to the death of 2 of them. This event is widely regarded as one of the most well-documented and well-studied close encounters of the second kind. Besides the 3 witnesses, many others would witness the craft, as well as the large number of military helicopters flying around that night. This incident became to be known as the Landrum case, named after the 3 witnesses. The first witness was Betty Cash. Betty then was a 51-year-old businesswoman who owned a restaurant and a grocery store. The second witness was Vicky Landrum. Vicky was 57 at the time and worked for Betty in the restaurant. Colby Landrum, Vicky's grandson, was the third witness, and at the time, he was then 7. Just outside Houston, Texas, in the town of Huffman, around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, Betty, Vicky, and Colby had been driving around the Piney Woods area of East Texas looking for a bingo game. After finding out all the games had been canceled, they decided to eat at a diner in New Caney. After finishing their meal around 8:20 p.m., Betty drove them home on Highway FM 1485, a remote road used only by people who live in the area because it is so isolated. Around 50 kilometers from Houston, the area is surprisingly sparsely populated and is covered by oak and pine trees, with swamps and lakes. Around 30 minutes later, Colby would spot a bright light above the treetops, a good distance away. He pointed it out to the women, and as they continued driving, it appeared to be getting larger and larger. Soon, though, the 3 would realize the object was getting closer and closer to the road, and they began to get worried. The woman thought, based on the speed it was going, they could drive by it and avoid it altogether. Soon, though, they realized the object had cut in front of them and was hovering right above the road. As they saw the burning, diamond-shaped craft, Vicky screamed that they would be burned alive if they kept driving. The object was hovering and also shooting down flames of fire occasionally. As the car eventually came to a full stop, the UFO was around 60 meters away. The witnesses would later describe it as being aluminum-like and glowing so bright that it lit up the surrounding forest like daylight. The 4 points of the diamond were dull rather than sharp, and blue spots circled around the object. It also let out some type of beeping sound as well. The fire was so dense and powerful under the UFO that if it hadn't been over the road, a forest fire surely would have ensued. As they watched the diamond-shaped UFO, the car's interior and exterior became heated and hot, which prompted the 3 to exit the vehicle. Feeling a burning sensation on their faces, the three watched the craft in disbelief. Colby would get back in the car first and beg his grandmother to get back in, but Vicky, a devout Christian, eventually got back in but was convinced, seeing the object, it was the end of the world and that Jesus would soon appear. Becky was staring at the object in a trance-like state. Betty was so fascinated by the UFO that she walked in front of the car and stood there gazing at it. The bright light penetrated her skin, burning it, yet she stood there completely in bliss. Eventually, as the object began to hover up and away, she moved back to the car door. When she finally grabbed the car door handle, it was so painfully hot that she had to open it using her leather jacket to protect her hands. As the witnesses all were in the car and the object had left, they then realized just how hot the car was and turned the air conditioner on in the dead of winter. As the UFO began leaving, military helicopters would begin circling the area and came flying in from all directions. Some of the helicopters were identified as large double-rotor CH-47 Chinooks, which are extremely loud and undeniably used in the military. Colby would later state he counted 23 helicopters that came to the spot. These and others would then begin spreading out as the UFO was not found nearby. After the helicopters had dispersed from the scene, Betty, Vicky, and Colby drove back to Dayton, where Betty dropped Vicky and Colby off at home. Betty would return home around 9:50 p.m. There, a friend and her children were waiting for her, but Betty was already starting to feel extremely sick from the event. She was so sick, in fact, that she couldn't even tell them what happened. Betty, Vicky, and Colby were not the only ones to witness the strange events that night, though. A Dayton, Texas policeman who was off duty and his wife were driving home from Cleveland through the Huffman area, and the same night they too also observed a large number of CH-47 helicopters. Another witness was a man living in Crosby, Texas. He was directly under the flight path of the UFO, and he reported seeing a large number of heavy military helicopters flying overhead. Jerry McDonald, who worked in the oil fields, was in the garden in the backyard in Dayton, and he reported seeing a huge UFO flying directly over his head. At first, he thought it was the Goodyear blimp, but quickly he realized it was something else. It passed about 45 meters above him, and he saw that it had two bright lights on it and a red light in the center. He was quoted as saying it was kind of diamond-shaped and had two twin torches that were shooting brilliant blue flames out the back. As we see, just like Betty Cash and the Landrums, he reported seeing a diamond object with flames. While the incident itself might have been quite fascinating for the women, the aftermath was extremely painful and life-altering. While many UFO sightings and abductions lead to incredible psychological pain, seldom do many of the victims suffer intense, apparent physical pain. In the Cash Landrum case, almost immediately the women began experiencing excruciating pain, which proves that something strange did happen on the night of December 29th, 1980. After returning home, after dropping off the Landrums, over the next few hours, Betty's skin turned red as if she had a bad sunburn. Her neck swelled, and large blisters erupted and broke out on her face. She even had blisters on her scalp and eyelids. She started to vomit and continued to do so non-stop during the night. By morning, she was even worse and almost in a coma. The Landrums would begin to experience their symptoms a bit later, Between midnight and 2 a.m., Vicky and Colby began to suffer similar symptoms, although less severe. At first, they began to get something sunburn-like, but then diarrhea and vomiting ensued. The next morning, Betty was moved to Vicky's house, and all three were cared for there. Betty's condition continued to worsen, and 3 days later, she went to the hospital. The burns and swelling altered Betty's appearance so radically that a friend who came to visit her in the hospital didn't recognize her. Her hair was starting to fall out, and her eyes became so swollen she couldn't see for a week. Doctors were perplexed and confused by these symptoms and guessed that they were caused by some type of radiation. The doctors just weren't sure of what could have caused this, though, and as a safety precaution, Betty was moved into a hazmat room in the basement level of the hospital. Visits to her were limited in the beginning because doctors couldn't assess whether she was a danger to others or not. Perhaps one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence surrounding the radiation, or perhaps the case in general, comes from Brad Sparks, a nuclear radiologist who examined the case for MUFON. Sparks determined the type of radiation was not ionizing radiation, which is the only type of radiation that causes radiation sickness. Microwave and UV radiation, as well as visible light radiation, do not and cannot cause radiation sickness. It's important to note all the victims showed signs of radiation sickness. One other thing that Sparks found concerned the onset of the radiation. The three experienced the radiation sickness so quickly that if it had been ionizing radiation, they would have died in weeks. If the Cash-Landrum trio had true radiation sickness from ionizing radiation, they would have been dead within days or weeks because the onset of the symptoms was so rapid within about half an hour and so severe that as the symptoms of supposed ionizing radiation syndrome, it indicates a 100% fatal dose. This finding raises the question, what type of radiation exactly did the witnesses encounter? One fascinating thing about this case, as well, is this incident occurred the night before the Rendlesham Forest incident in England. That incident is considered one of the most famous in the world, and shockingly, there are similar characteristics between the two. Both had intense heat, and verifiable radiological after effects were associated with both events. Both events had craft that shared design elements, including diamond and pyramid shapes. Still, this isn't the first time a person has suffered similar radiological effects from a close encounter of the second kind. On May 20th, 1967, around lunchtime, Stephen Michalak, an industrial mechanic from Winnipeg, was prospecting in the Falcon Lake area of Manitoba, Canada, when he alleged to come into physical contact with a landed UFO. Michalak would later experience radiation sickness and burns. The area was examined as well and found to be radioactive. We will examine this case, regarded as one of Canada's most famous, in more detail in future episodes. After the event, John Schuessler of MUFON was one of many who would examine the event. He organized a team of specialists that were able to find additional eyewitnesses, as well as scorch marks on nearby trees. Perhaps evidence of a military cover-up was the discovery that the stretch of highway where the sighting happened was quickly repaved just days after the event. There was no paper trail with Montgomery County or the state of Texas. An unnamed witness later came forward and stated driving to work in the early dark hours, he saw a road crew paving the road where the UFO was seen. He was routed another direction and thought it was odd at the time because both sides of the road were closed. At the time, he wasn't aware of the UFO sightings, and only later did he make the connection. A History Channel episode of UFO hunters would examine this and uncover the remote road was indeed completely replaced with new pavement. After all the suffering the women went through, they were convinced that this was an experimental craft from the US military and that it had caused their suffering and illness. As such, they filed a lawsuit against the US government in 1982. However, legal attempts to get answers from the government failed time and time again because it could not be proven that the UFO or the helicopters were US government property. Finally, in 1986, a judge dismissed the entire case, citing expert testimony that no such craft existed in the military. Over the years, there's been various theories as to what the Landrums and Betty Cash saw that night. The most popular, probably, is that this was an experimental military craft. This seems to be the most popular theory because the number of military helicopters seen in close proximity to the craft. Many feel the helicopters wouldn't have been able to get to the craft so quickly unless it was a military exercise. Others dispute this though and point out if a UFO had came down and had been ground level for some time, the military could have mobilized and reached it. The radiation from the craft also leads some people to believe that this was an experimental nuclear engine powered military craft. However, it's unlikely the military would fly something emitting radiation in the public. For something like this, they would almost certainly fly it in one of their restricted areas where only military is allowed. The second theory holds that this was indeed a UFO. This seems to be the theory that makes the most sense. The craft was described as 90 feet tall, and today, even 43 years later, we don't have anything that large capable of flying. Also, the fact that the Rendlesham Forest incident occurred and the radiation was non-ionizing, yet caused immediate sickness, leads many to conclude it was from an unknown origin. John Schuessler, lead MUFON investigator on the Cash Landrum case, concluded that the craft wasn't one of ours. The last theory holds that this event didn't occur. This seems extremely unlikely given the pain and suffering the witnesses occurred, both physically and mentally. The events would affect the rest of their lives. Also, the incident was seen by multiple witnesses. This case has been studied intensely for decades, and to date, we're no closer to solving this mystery than we were 40 years ago. In the fall of 2022, Dale Hancher, his wife Colleen, and their friend Myrna Germaine Brown were enjoying a warm day on Okanagan Lake in British Columbia, Canada. As the day progressed, off in the distant water, Dale would spot something floating above the surface he couldn't make out. As the three looked on in confusion, Dale told Colleen to grab the camera so they could get a photo. As they got about 10 feet away, Colleen snapped a photo, and the three continued on, puzzled as to what it could be. As Dale later recalled,
"As a boater, I was just looking. Is this something dangerous that needs to be marked so somebody doesn't run into it, like a dead head or something like that? For one thing, the two nodular things are sticking up. Whatever they are, those that are about 3 feet apart. And I've done some research since we took this picture. And it's not a plant. It's not kelp because this is a lake. It's not the ocean. It's not a sturgeon. It's not a dead deer upside down. You can eliminate all these things, but the next question is, what is it?"
As the story gained traction, many in Okanagan Valley would suggest what Dale, Colleen, and Myrna saw was the legendary lake monster named Ogopogo. For centuries, native tribes of the area, such as the Sekmoek and the Silt, told stories of a lake monster, which they called Inhahaik. Inhahaik translates several ways, including water god or water demon. In their traditions, and to show reverence to the creature, crossing of the lake demanded sacrificing a small animal. Native lore tells a story of a visiting chief named Chief Timbasket, who failed to show respect. Chief Timbasket refused to sacrifice a small animal due to his denial of the demon creature. As Chief Timbasket took his family across the lake, the monster would attack the family and suck them to the bottom of the lake. Native tribes believed the lake monster was a spirit that inhabited the caves under Rattlesnake Island. As the years passed and more Europeans would settle into the area, one early settler was a woman with impeccable credentials, and she would spot the creature and perhaps give the first valid sighting to the legend. Susan Allen was a renowned Canadian author and pioneer. In 1860, Susan and her family immigrated to Hope, British Columbia. She would then go on to marry John Fall Allison, one of the founders of the town in Princeton in the year 1868. The couple then moved to Silmakin Valley near the Okanagan Lake, and the Allisons were able to establish good relationships with the local tribes. Together, the two had 14 children, and Susan was able to translate many stories from the tribes into English and record many of her memories of that time through several famous literary works. In her writings, Susan recalls in 1872 seeing a large, serpent-like creature that she was certain was a dinosaur. Yet other sightings occurred in the 20th century as well. 15 years earlier, Métis settler John McDougall claimed that as he had crossed the lake in his canoe, he had his horses tied behind him when suddenly the horses were violently pulled under, and McDougall had to cut the ropes to prevent capsizing. McDougall was adamant he had crossed this exact same way many, many times. Lake Okanagan is about 250 miles east of Vancouver. The massive lake is about 84 miles long and between 2.5 to 3 miles wide, with an average depth of 249 feet. The stunning beauty of the area is such that it has attracted travelers and tourists for decades for activities such as hiking, boating, and camping. Still, within the massive lake lies much mystery. One such mystery lies in the formation of unexplainable waves. For local residents, there is no doubt that the strange disturbance has often been observed and even photographed on the surface. It appears that when the lake is otherwise calm and there are no boats on the water, anyone who has seen this phenomenon knows that the wave they are seeing is no ordinary wave. Exactly what causes this disturbance is a matter of debate. It may be the result of underwater currents, rising gases, seasonal overturn, or changing temperatures in the lake. Still, in this massive, mysterious lake, the biggest question lies around if there is indeed a lake creature residing there. Although the older reports from Native Americans and Susan Allison provide support for the existence of Ogopogo, the modern reports and wide variety of reports, many with videos and photographs, provide even more support the monster does exist. In 1968, Arthur Folden was driving on Highway 97 when he noticed something moving in the lake. He pulled off the road and filmed what he believed was footage of the creature, and it showed a large wave moving across the water. Folden estimated that Ogopogo was 300 yards offshore. Many sightings would occur in the 1980s, with a reward being posted as well. In 1980, around 50 tourists watched an alleged Ogopogo for about 45 minutes off a beach at Kelowna. There, Larry Tall, visiting from Vancouver, shot some 8mm film capturing the beast for around 10 seconds. In 1989, John Kirk reportedly saw an animal which was around 35 to 40 feet long and consisted of five sleek, jet black humps with a lashing tail. He believed it to be traveling at around 25 miles per hour. Sightings continued through the 90s and the 2000s with additional reports. One report of particular interest was that of Sean Valoria and his girlfriend in August 2008. Valoria and his girlfriend, Jessica Wiegers, were sitting on the lakeshore of Peachland as she noticed a disturbance in the water. Sean, an experienced photographer, snapped one photograph, but then, unfortunately, his camera died, and he wasn't able to capture more. Sean never publicized this or spoke of it much, but he did describe the creature as having black hump-like ridges. Surprisingly, 8 days later, south of the original sighting, Sean pulled his car over to watch it, the Highway 97 widening project, and Jessica spotted another disturbance. He snapped 11 photographs of the creature as it was surfacing near a boat. One of the pictures shows a tail or net-like object surfacing the water, while the others show the back and the head of the creature. Sean estimated the creature being about 18 to 20 feet long, based on the boat in the background. The photos were examined by many local experts, and all concluded that it didn't look like any known animal of the lake. Members of the show Monster Quest also studied the photographs and found no evidence of tampering. Descriptions have varied regarding Ogopogo, but certain characteristics have been repeated through the decades. Ogopogo is said to be green with a snail-like body, about 25 meters long. Some say its head looks like a horse, while others say that it's reptilian or goat-like. Still, over the years, different theories have been proposed as to what specifically people have been seeing. Some scientists have put forth the theory that Lake Okanagan creature is probably a form of a primitive whale. And that description of that primitive whale would agree with many descriptions of what many people have claimed to have seen. Other believers think that it could be some prehistoric dinosaur that has managed to seek out the shelter in this massive lake unhidden for years. However, skeptics think that the more recent sightings of Ogopogo were most likely something like waterfowl, otter, or beaver. Sturgeon are another popular suggestion for the skeptics. They are often mistaken as lake monsters, but believers point out their existence in Lake Okanagan is unclear. In fact, there is currently an unclaimed $10,000 reward for concrete evidence of a sturgeon in the lake. Benjamin Radford, a skeptic on the matter, points out that waterspouts are in the lake, and that activity may have led native tribes to believe that gods existed below the surface. Perhaps the individual with the most knowledge concerning the creature and sightings is Kelowna resident Bill Stusek. He has become to be known as the Ogopogo Man and runs a website named www.ogopogo.com. ogopogoquest.com, where many reported sightings are archived. Stusek has been hoping to prove the existence of Ogopogo ever since he believed he saw the elusive legend in October of 1978. He and a group of believers have set out to prove scientifically that Ogopogo does indeed exist. Unlike many cryptids, there appears to be an overwhelming amount of evidence supporting that some creature does exist in the lake. There have been many eyewitness reports, often multiple witnesses together over the decades, and very often these reports are accompanied with photographic and video evidence. Investigations under the water, too, using devices such as sonar, have found suspicious activity, leading investigators to believe a large creature or creatures might be lurking around the waters. As the creature has continued to gain fame on an international scale, let's hope that the smoking gun, solid evidence, is one day finally found. In April of 1908, a French magazine named Je suis toi would publish a collection of stories involving a strange beast said to be roaming the western Yukon Territory in Canada. Written by George Dupuy, the stories would captivate the minds of readers and lead to much speculation as to what this beast was. A year after the stories were published, they were translated into English and published in the Strand magazine. Without question, the most famous of these stories occurred in 1903 and involves several men eyewitnessing a large dinosaur-like creature in the wild. In today's episode, we will examine the story as well as the possibility of such a creature still existing. In 1903, Canadian hunters James Butler and Tom Lemore were out tracking a large moose in a place known as Patridge Creek. As the two men hiked through the wet area, they soon discovered a large indentation in the mud. Some enormous creature had left massive footprints around 2.5 feet wide and what appeared to be a tail path. The tail path measured around 10 feet. The men abandoned tracking the moose and began cautiously following the large tracks. They would lose the trail in a large ditch as the tracks disappeared. The men then headed to the Armstrong Creek trading post. At this spot, the men had planned on rendezvousing with George Dupuy. As the men met with Dupuy, they told him the story, but Dupuy was extremely skeptical. After some time, the men decided to form a hunting party. Lemore, Butler, and Dupuy would all go. The men would also recruit Reverend Pierre Lavenant and a few members of the First Nation tribe. The men weren't sure what the creature was or how dangerous, but there was a general concern as many families lived in the area. As such, the men went out heavily armed and ready to anticipate they would be taking down something massive. Once the men got to Patridge Creek, they set up camp. Some time went by and nothing happened. Then, finally, the men heard a bone-chilling growl, and the men hopped up and grabbed their weapons. The creature would emerge. It was a massive, around 50 feet long, with a horn on its snout and spikes running down its back. It was on all fours, but sensed the men and stood up on its hind legs, letting out a ferocious roar. Rather than attack the men, the monster headed another direction toward a waterway and vanished. It would later be said that the creature was similar to a Ceratosaurus, a dinosaur that went extinct millions of years ago. While this sighting is the most famous of the beasts of Patridge Creek, it is not the only one to occur. A few years later, in 1907, another sighting would occur. Reverend Lavenant and 10 of his parishioners would report seeing the creature. This time the monster was carrying a caribou in its mouth. The Reverend wrote a letter to Dupuy about this event. Dupuy wasn't initially going to write the story of his encounter in the beast. He believed it was too strange. However, after getting the Reverend's letter, he decided to move forward with the stories. Over the years, there's been much skepticism and critique of the beast of Patridge Creek. Many say there's no way something that big could live and still be undiscovered by modern society. One other thing critics point to is the harsh, frigid conditions of the Yukon Territory. It is said an animal that size, if it is really a living Ceratosaurus, wouldn't be able to survive the cold. However, there have been many findings of dinosaurs in the Arctic, suggesting these animals could survive in very cold conditions. It should also be pointed out there is still much debate over what dinosaurs lived where and what temperatures they thrived in. While many scoff at the notion of dinosaurs potentially still living in cold conditions, we should point out an interesting series of stories that occurred in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. It was reported that several dinosaur-like creatures were seen on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Several hunters would manage to find a young corpse of one of them that was killed in the wilderness. Some speculated during this time that some of these creatures might have crossed the Bering Strait to Alaska when it was cold enough. Some think that the beast of Patridge Creek is a new species. It could be one that is semi-aquatic or potentially hibernates during the harsh winter. There are countless examples of animals adapting to survive in nature. One example is the tree frog that survives in the Yukon region. To respond to freezing temperatures, the body of the frog floods its body with cryoprotectants that help keep the frog from freezing. They also bury themselves deep in the snow when it gets extremely cold. Many will also question an animal that size getting enough food. It should be said though, many massive animals in the polar regions hibernate in order to survive. While stories around the beast of Patridge Creek are certainly fascinating, it should be said that no physical evidence was ever collected. There were no footprint castings, photos, or other hard evidence. Some of this is understandable though, as cameras weren't in widespread use and people didn't hunt with casting material. It seems more likely than not this cryptid doesn't exist. Perhaps it did at one time though. If it did, it would surely be a fascinating one and one that would raise many questions.